They were told Americans would rape them, torture them, parade them through streets as trophies of war. But when 127 Japanese nurses stepped off a cargo ship in San Francisco Bay, August 1945, the enemy broke them not with violence, but with two quiet words spoken in broken Japanese. Kawai nai. Don't be afraid. For women who had sewn cyanide pills into their uniform hems, who had practiced biting their tongues to bleed out rather than face capture, those words were more shocking than any cruelty. They expected death. They received blankets. They expected shame. They received warm milk and cookies. And in that moment, everything they had been taught about the enemy began to crumble. If this story moves you, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. These forgotten moments of history deserve to be remembered. August 17th, 1945. 2 days after Emperor Hirohito's radio broadcast. 2 days since the unthinkable words, "The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage," had crackled through speakers across the Pacific. On a small island in the Mariana chain, 127 Japanese military nurses stood in formation on a bombed-out airstrip, their white uniforms stained with months of blood, dirt, and desperation. Nurse Keiko Yamamoto was 23 years old. Her hands still shook from the morphine injection she had given to a dying soldier the night before. Their last morphine used on a boy who would not live to see sunrise. Her medical bag, once full of supplies, now held only a comb, a photograph of her family in Osaka, and a small vial sewn into the lining. Cyanide. Every nurse carried one. The American soldiers who came for them moved with military precision, but without the brutality they had been warned about. No bayonets drawn, no shouted insults, just tired men in dusty uniforms pointing toward the transport trucks. The nurses climbed aboard in silence, backs rigid, eyes forward. Some prayed quietly. Others gripped the cyanide vials through the fabric of their bags. 18-year-old nurse Yuki Tanaka sat in the back of the truck, her heart hammering so hard she thought the woman next to her could hear it. She had graduated nursing school only 8 months ago. Her first assignment had been a field hospital on Saipan. Her entire adult life had been war. The trucks rolled toward the coast where a massive cargo ship waited, its hull painted gray, an American flag snapping in the Pacific wind. Up the gangway they marched, single file, their cloth shoes barely making sound on the metal. Below deck they were directed into a hold that had been converted into temporary quarters. Steel bunks, bare walls, the smell of paint and oil. But then something unexpected. As each nurse entered, an American sailor handed her something, a folded blanket, thick, clean olive green. The weight of it in Keiko's arms was shocking. For months they had slept on bamboo mats, if they slept at all. Some nurses stared at the blankets in confusion. Others clutched them like life preservers. The ship's engines thrummed to life, a deep vibration that moved through the hull and into their bones. They were leaving Japanese-held territory, leaving the war, leaving everything they knew, heading toward America, the land of the enemy, the land they had been trained to fear more than death itself. That first night at sea, most could not sleep. The hold was dark except for small safety lights that cast everything in dim red. The nurses lay in their bunks, still in their uniforms, blankets pulled to their chins. Whispers moved through the darkness like ghosts. They will separate us when we arrive. They will question us, torture us for information. We must be strong. We must not shame our families. But then, cutting through the whispers, a voice from the doorway. An American sailor, young, maybe 20, standing at the entrance with a clipboard. He spoke slowly, carefully, in broken Japanese that sounded like it had been practiced from a phrase book. Shokuji. Food. Come, please. The nurses looked at each other. Was this a trick? A test? Slowly, cautiously, they followed him up metal stairs and through narrow passages until they emerged into a mess hall. Long tables, bright lights, and the smell. Oh, the smell that hit them was overwhelming. Food, real food. Not the watery rice gruel they had been surviving on. Not the bitter wild plants they had boiled to supplement their rations. The steam rising from metal trays carried scents they had almost forgotten. Bread, meat, something sweet. American sailors stood behind the serving line, spooning portions onto plates. Mashed potatoes, some kind of meat and gravy, carrots, bread rolls, and in small paper cups, milk, fresh milk. The nurses stood frozen in line, plates in hand, unable to process what was happening. This was not starvation. This was not cruelty. This was dinner? Keiko accepted her plate with trembling hands. The sailor serving her was older, maybe 40, with graying hair and tired eyes. He looked at her, really looked at her, and did something that would replay in her mind for the rest of her life. He smiled, a small, sad smile, and then he added an extra roll to her plate. Tears sprang to her eyes before she could stop them. She turned away quickly, ashamed, and found a seat at one of the long tables. Around her, other nurses sat in stunned silence, staring at their plates as if they might disappear. Young Yuki picked up her fork, a real fork, not a carved stick, and cut into the meat. It was tender, warm. She put it in her mouth and nearly sobbed. When was the last time she had tasted meat? March? February? Before Saipan fell? Some nurses ate slowly, carefully, as if expecting to be stopped at any moment. Others could not eat at all, too overwhelmed by fear and confusion. A few wept quietly into their hands, shoulders shaking with silent tears. But everyone noticed the same thing. The Americans were not mocking them, not standing over them with weapons, not forcing them to grovel or beg. They were simply serving dinner. Wait. The fear still gripped their hearts. Every face around them was the enemy. But the food was real. The blankets were real. And somewhere in the contradiction between what they expected and what they experienced, a tiny crack began to form in the wall of their terror. 5 days later, the Golden Gate Bridge emerged from the morning fog like something from a dream. The nurses crowded the deck, staring at the massive orange structure, at the city beyond, at the hills dotted with houses that showed no signs of bombing. San Francisco glittered in the August sun, untouched, thriving, alive. Yuki stood at the rail, gripping the cold metal, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. This was the enemy homeland? This was the nation they had been told was suffering, collapsing, desperate? The buildings were whole. The bridges stood. Ships filled the harbor, not warships, but cargo vessels, fishing boats, ferries moving people across the bay. Japan, she knew, was in ruins. Tokyo had burned. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been erased. Her own city of Nagoya had been firebombed in March. And yet here stood America, as if the war had happened somewhere else entirely. The ship docked at a military facility on the bay. Buses waited, their engines running. The nurses were directed off the ship and onto the vehicles. Still no violence, still no shouting, just tired military police checking clipboards and pointing directions. They drove through the city. Keiko pressed her face to the window, drinking in every detail. People on sidewalks, women in colorful dresses, children riding bicycles, shops with full windows. Cars, so many cars. Music drifting from a bar, laughter. Normal life continuing as if the greatest war in human history had not just ended days ago. The bus pulled into a facility that looked like a school or hospital. Clean buildings, manicured grass, American flags and Red Cross symbols. They were led inside, still in formation, still silent, still waiting for the cruelty to begin. But instead of interrogation rooms, they were taken to a processing center. Medical staff, American nurses in crisp white uniforms, waited with clipboards and gentle expressions. They were older women, many of them with gray in their hair and kind eyes that had seen too much. One of them, a tall woman with silver hair pulled back in a bun, stepped forward. Through an interpreter, she explained what would happen next. Medical examinations, delousing, clean uniforms, documentation. Her voice was calm, professional, but there was something else in it too. Something that sounded almost like compassion. The nurses were divided into groups and led to different rooms. Keiko found herself in a white-tiled shower room with a dozen other women. They stood in their stained uniforms, backs rigid, waiting. An American nurse entered, carrying a basket. She was younger, maybe 30, with brown hair and freckles across her nose. She spoke through the interpreter, gesturing to the showers, to the basket of supplies. "You will shower. We have soap, shampoo, and clean towels. Take your time. The water is warm. After, we have clean clothes for you. Soap, shampoo, warm water." The words seemed to come from another universe. The interpreter left. The American nurse smiled, and that same sad, gentle smile, and set the basket on a bench. Then she did something that shocked them even more. She turned her back and left the room, closing the door behind her, giving them privacy. For a long moment, no one moved. Then slowly, hesitantly, one nurse began to undress, then another. Soon they were all removing their uniforms, those white dresses that had become symbols of their service, now just dirty rags stained with the war. The showers had multiple heads, and when Keiko turned the handle, hot water burst forth. Not lukewarm, not cold. Hot. She stepped under the stream and felt months of grime, sweat, blood, and fear begin to wash away. The soap smelled like flowers, like the jasmine that grew in her grandmother's garden before the war. Around her, women were crying. Not from fear this time, but from the overwhelming sensation of being clean, of hot water on skin that had been cold for so long, of soap that lathered rich and white instead of the harsh lye bars they had used on the islands. Yuki stood under her shower head, eyes closed, and let the water run through her hair. She had lice. They all did. The thought of finally being rid of them, of the constant itching and shame, made her throat tight with emotion. When they emerged, wrapped in towels that were soft and clean, the American nurse had returned with another basket. Inside were simple cotton dresses, underwear, and sandals. Nothing fancy, but all of it clean, all of it whole. As Keiko pulled the dress over her head, feeling the soft fabric against her clean skin, something inside her shifted. This was not torture, this was not degradation, this was kindness, and she had no idea how to process that. After processing, they were led to a dining hall. It was nothing fancy, a simple cafeteria with long tables and plastic chairs. But to the nurses, stepping through those doors was like entering another world. The smell hit them first. Cooking food, bread baking, coffee brewing, scents that belonged to peacetime, to normal life, to a world they had almost forgotten existed. American staff stood behind serving counters, spooning food onto plates. But this time there was something different. Several Japanese-American women stood among them, interpreters and volunteers who had been brought in to help ease the transition. One of them, an elderly woman named Mrs. Nakamura, spoke to them in perfect Japanese as they entered the line. "Welcome. You are safe here. Please, eat as much as you like. No one will hurt you." Her words, spoken in their mother tongue by a kind grandmother's voice, broke something in many of them. Tears flowed freely now. Women who had held themselves rigid with fear for days began to crack. The food was American. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, dinner rolls. There was butter. Real butter. And on another table, pitchers of cold milk and what looked like chocolate cake. Keiko took her plate with both hands, treating it like precious cargo. She found a seat at one of the long tables, and as she sat down, she noticed something that made her heart clench. Across from her sat a young American nurse, maybe her age, eating the same food. Not watching them, not guarding them, just eating lunch. Their eyes met for a brief second. The American girl smiled just a little, then returned to her meal. It was such a normal gesture, such a simple human moment, that it felt almost revolutionary. Yuki cut into her meatloaf. The meat was seasoned, juicy, nothing like the tough dried fish or occasional spam they had eaten on the islands. She put a forkful in her mouth and her eyes widened. It was delicious. The potatoes were creamy, rich with butter. The beans were tender, seasoned with something she could not identify. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, acutely aware that her stomach would rebel if she ate too fast after months of near starvation. But oh, it was hard to go slowly when every bite tasted like a memory of life before the war. Around the room, nurses ate with varying reactions. Some devoured their food with desperate hunger. Others picked at it delicately, unable to shake the fear that it might be taken away. Several could not eat at all, too overwhelmed by the situation, by the kindness that felt more dangerous than cruelty because they had no defense against it. Mrs. Nakamura moved through the tables, speaking softly in Japanese, reassuring them. When she reached Keiko's table, she paused and placed a gentle hand on Keiko's shoulder. "You are wondering why," Mrs. Nakamura said quietly. "Why they are being kind. I will tell you. Because this is what civilized nations do. Because the war is over and you are no longer enemies. You are just young women far from home." Keiko looked up at her, tears streaming down her face. "But we were told. They said Americans would—" "I know what you were told," Mrs. Nakamura said softly. "I know what lies you were fed. Now you will see the truth. It may be harder to accept than any lie." When the meal was finished, they were shown to their quarters. Not cells, not barracks, but dormitory rooms with real beds, clean sheets, and windows that looked out onto gardens where flowers grew. Each bed had a pillow. Each woman was given a small locker for personal items. That night, lying in a real bed for the first time in months, Keiko stared at the ceiling and tried to reconcile what she had expected with what she had experienced. They had been taught that Americans were demons, but demons did not give you soap and warm milk. Demons did not smile sadly and add extra bread rolls to your plate. The contradiction was not just confusing, it was terrifying. Because if the Americans were not demons, then what did that make the people who had told them they were? The dormitory held 16 beds, 8 on each side. The nurses had been assigned to rooms based on their hospital units, so Keiko found herself with women she had served alongside. Yuki was there, 2 beds down, and Nurse Hana Sato, a 26-year-old from Kyoto who had been their informal leader during the evacuation. That first night after lights out, they lay in darkness and spoke in whispers. These were the conversations that would never make it into official records, the raw processing of trauma and confusion that happens when people who have been through hell together try to make sense of heaven. "This is a trick," whispered one nurse from across the room. "They are trying to make us lower our guard. Tomorrow the truth will come." "But why?" another responded. "Why feed us so well if they plan to kill us? To fatten us up first. You are being ridiculous." "Am I? Can any of you explain what is happening?" Silence fell, heavy and uncertain. Because no, none of them could explain it. Everything they had been taught, everything they had been prepared for, had been wrong, and that wrongness was more unsettling than any cruelty could have been. Yuki spoke up, her young voice carrying in the darkness. "My father told me, before I left for nursing school, that Americans value individual life above all else. He said it was their weakness, that they could never defeat Japan because they feared death. But I have been thinking, what if it is not a weakness? What if it is something else? Careful, Yuki, Hana warned. Those thoughts are dangerous. More dangerous than being prisoners of war? Yuki shot back. More dangerous than what we have already survived? I'm just trying to understand. Keiko pulled her blanket up to her chin, that thick, clean, warm blanket that smelled faintly of detergent. I keep thinking about the sailor who served me dinner on the ship. He looked at me like I was a person. Not a prisoner, not an enemy. Just a person. When did we stop being people to each other? We are still enemies, Hana said firmly. Do not forget that. The war may be over, but we still represent the nation that attacked Pearl Harbor, that fought them across the Pacific. This kindness, it could be policy, a strategy. Or, Keiko said quietly, it could be who they actually are. That thought hung in the darkness, too large and too frightening to fully examine. Because if the Americans were genuinely kind, genuinely civilized, genuinely committed to treating even their enemies with dignity, then what did that say about everything they had sacrificed for? What did it say about the empire that had sent them to war? Sleep came slowly that night, and when it came, it was fitful, filled with dreams of burning cities and gentle hands, of cyanide pills and chocolate cake, of everything they had believed colliding with everything they were experiencing. In the morning, they would wake to another breakfast, another day of this strange captivity that felt less like punishment and more like refuge. And with each passing hour, the gap between expectation and reality would grow wider until something had to give, either their understanding of the Americans or their understanding of themselves. The days developed a rhythm that felt surreal in its normalcy. Wake at 7 a.m. to a bell, not a siren. Breakfast in the dining hall, eggs, toast, coffee, sometimes oatmeal with brown sugar and raisins. Then, work. The nurses had expected forced labor, brutal conditions, punishment disguised as productivity. Instead, they were offered jobs, real jobs with real compensation. They could work in the facility's hospital wing, helping care for wounded American soldiers returning from the Pacific. They could work in the kitchens, the laundry, the administrative offices, or they could attend English classes, vocational training, or simply rest and recover from their ordeal. Keiko chose the hospital. She was a nurse. It was all she knew, all she had trained for. The thought of not using her skills felt like losing herself entirely. On her first morning, she was paired with Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, a U.S. Army nurse from Iowa who had served in field hospitals in France. Lieutenant Morrison was in her early 30s, tall and efficient, with dark blonde hair pulled back in a practical bun. She shook Keiko's hand. Actually shook it as if they were colleagues, not captor and prisoner. Through an interpreter, she explained, "You'll work alongside our staff. Same duties, same hours. We're short-handed with so many boys still in the Pacific. If you need anything, you ask. Understood?" Keiko nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. She was given a clean white uniform, an American nurse's uniform with a Red Cross armband. She put it on with trembling fingers, staring at herself in the locker room mirror. 3 weeks ago, she had been an enemy. Now she wore the same uniform as the women who had defeated her nation. The work was familiar yet strange. The soldiers in the beds were American boys, many younger than her. They had shrapnel wounds from Pacific Islands, malaria from New Guinea, burns from kamikaze attacks. They looked at her with curiosity, sometimes suspicion, but rarely hatred. One morning, she was checking vitals on a private from Montana who had lost his left leg on Iwo Jima. He watched her work in silence, then finally spoke. The interpreter translated, "You're really good at this. Been a nurse long?" Keiko looked up, startled. He was asking her a question. A real question, like a person might ask another person. 3 years, she replied through the interpreter. He nodded. "My sister's a nurse, too, in Texas. You remind me of her a little, same careful hands." And then he smiled at her. This boy who had lost his leg fighting Japan, who had every reason to hate her, smiled and compared her to his sister. Keiko finished her check and moved to the next bed, her vision blurred with tears she could not shed in front of the patients. Yuki took a different path. She chose the English classes, hungry to understand the language of their captors, to read between the lines of what was being said and what was being left unsaid. The teacher was a Japanese-American man named Mr. Hayashi, who had been born in California and had spent the war in an internment camp himself. His presence confused her. Here was a man of Japanese blood who was American, who spoke English as his first language, who had been imprisoned by his own government yet still taught them with patience and pride in American ideals. "The Constitution says all men are created equal," he told them in Japanese, writing the English words on the blackboard. "America does not always live up to these words. My family was imprisoned for our Japanese faces, but the words exist, and they matter. They create a goal, a standard to fight for. Does your empire have such words? The question hung in the air. No one answered, because they all knew the answer. The emperor was divine. The people existed to serve. There was hierarchy, duty, and honor, but there were no words about equality. In the evenings, the nurses gathered in a common room where they could listen to the radio, read newspapers, or simply talk. American staff came and went freely, never locking doors, never counting heads obsessively. The trust itself felt like a weapon. But the abundance that surrounded them came with a heavy price, knowledge of what they had left behind. Letters began to arrive, not from everyone's families. The mail system between occupied Japan and America was still chaotic, but enough came through to paint a devastating picture. Keiko received a letter from her younger sister in Osaka. The paper was thin, rationed. The handwriting was shaky. Dear sister, we are surviving. That is all I can say. The city is mostly gone. We live in a shelter made from corrugated metal. Mother trades her kimono for rice. We eat once a day if we are lucky. The Americans give food sometimes, but there are so many of us. I am glad you are alive, but I wonder if you have food where you are. Here there is never enough. Your sister, Michiko. Keiko read it in her dormitory bed, and something inside her broke. That morning she had eaten scrambled eggs, bacon, toast with jam, and orange juice, while her mother traded family heirlooms for rice. She was not alone. Yuki received word that her father had died in the bombing of Nagoya. Hana learned that her brother, a soldier, was missing and presumed dead in Manchuria. The weight of survivors' guilt pressed down on them like a physical thing. They sat together one evening, 3 nurses who had bonded through shared trauma, and spoke the unspeakable. We are eating 3 meals a day while they starve, Keiko said, her voice hollow. We have warm beds while they sleep in ruins. We are safe while they lost everything, Hana finished. Her face was stone, but her hands shook. My brother died fighting Americans, and now I wear an American uniform and check American pulses and accept American kindness. What does that make me? Alive, Yuki said quietly. It makes us alive, and maybe that is the cruelest part. The contradiction between their daily reality and the reality of their homeland was impossible to reconcile. They walked through American halls, ate American food, learned American words, while Japan burned and starved. Some nurses began to understand something painful. America had not just won the war militarily. They had won it economically, industrially, spiritually. While Japan had sent its women to war zones with expired morphine and rice balls, America sent its soldiers with full medical kits and hot meals. While Japan told its people to die with honor, America told its people to live and win. The observations accumulated like weights. They saw American soldiers complain about the food, about food that would have been a feast in Japan. They saw waste bins full of half-eaten meals. They saw abundance so great that people could afford to be picky, wasteful, casual about wealth that would save lives in Osaka or Tokyo or Hiroshima. And they saw something else, the casual way American soldiers treated their officers. Yes, there was respect, military protocol, but there was also joking, questioning, a lack of absolute hierarchy. An American private could speak to a lieutenant without terror, could disagree, could be wrong without facing brutal punishment. It was a different world, and whether they wanted to or not, they were learning its rules, its values, its shocking suggestion that individual human life mattered more than abstract national honor. 3 weeks into their captivity, something remarkable happened. It started small, with a gesture so simple it almost went unnoticed. Keiko was working her shift in the hospital when Lieutenant Morrison approached her, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She held one out to Keiko, and through the interpreter, who hovered nearby less and less these days, said, "Break time. You've been on your feet for 5 hours." Keiko took the cup, confused. Officers did not serve enlisted personnel. Captors did not serve prisoners. And yet here was this American lieutenant handing her coffee as if they were equals. They sat in the break room, and Lieutenant Morrison pulled out a photograph. Her wedding photo. "My husband," she said, and even without translation, the love in her voice was clear. "He's still in France. Haven't seen him in 18 months. Keiko looked at the photo, a young man in uniform, smiling at a woman in a white dress. It could have been any couple, any country, any war. She thought of the letters she had received from a young doctor in Tokyo before the war had consumed everything. He was probably dead now. "You?" Lieutenant Morrison asked, gesturing to Keiko's bare ring finger. Keiko shook her head. "No, there was someone, but..." She trailed off. How to explain that personal happiness had been selfish during wartime? That duty had consumed everything? Lieutenant Morrison reached across and briefly squeezed her hand. Just a moment of contact, one woman to another, acknowledging loss without words. These moments multiplied. An American cook taught Yuki how to make apple pie, laughing at her first attempt at crimping the crust. A maintenance worker named Joe, who spoke a little Japanese from his time in Okinawa, spent his lunch breaks teaching the nurses American slang, delighting in their shocked reactions to casual profanity. One evening, a group of American nurses invited some of the Japanese nurses to listen to the radio in their lounge. They were playing big band music. Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman, and one of the Americans, a young nurse from New Orleans named Betsy, grabbed Keiko's hands and tried to teach her to jitterbug. It was absurd. It was surreal. Keiko, who had carried cyanide pills in her hem just weeks ago, was now laughing as an American nurse tried to teach her to dance. When she stumbled and they both nearly fell, they dissolved into giggles that erased 3 years of propaganda in an instant. But not everyone adjusted. Some nurses held themselves apart, maintaining rigid distance from their captors. They saw collaboration in every friendly gesture, betrayal in every smile. And they were not entirely wrong. There was something dangerous in this kindness, something that threatened identity itself. To accept American humanity meant questioning Japanese superiority. To acknowledge that the enemy had honor meant confronting the possibility that their side had lacked it. These were thoughts that could break a person, and some chose the safety of hatred over the danger of understanding. But for those who opened themselves to it, who allowed the walls to crack even just a little, something profound was happening. They were learning that the world was larger and more complicated than they had been taught, that enemies could become, if not friends, then at least human beings worthy of respect. 6 weeks into captivity, Keiko sat on her bed holding 2 objects that represented the war inside her mind. In her left hand, a photograph of her family in Osaka, taken before the war. In her right hand, a pay stub from the facility. She had earned $15 for 2 weeks of work in the hospital. $15. In America, it was pocket change. In Japan, it could feed her family for a month. But she could not send it. The monetary systems were incompatible, the postal service unreliable. The money was useless to help them, and the guilt of having it felt like swallowing broken glass. Around her, other nurses wrestled with similar contradictions. They performed their duties with the same discipline they had shown in the Japanese military, but now that discipline served American patients. They bowed respectfully to American officers, ingrained cultural habits toward authority that now felt like collaboration. Late at night, Keiko wrote in a journal she had been given. The words came in Japanese, thoughts too dangerous to speak aloud even to her fellow prisoners. I no longer know who I am. When I put on the American nurse uniform, am I betraying my nation? When I smile at Lieutenant Morrison, am I forgetting my brothers who died fighting her countrymen? When I eat the food they give me and feel grateful, am I losing myself? The emperor said we must endure the unendurable, but which is harder, to die with honor or to live with confusion? I was taught that death was preferable to capture. I carried poison to ensure it. But they took even that choice from me when they showed kindness. You cannot die to escape kindness. You can only live with it and let it change you. Yuki's transformation was different but equally profound. At 19, she had known only war. She had been shaped by propaganda, by national emergency, by the constant drumbeat of sacrifice and duty. But in English class, Mr. Hayashi introduced her to concepts that shattered her worldview. Democracy, individual rights, government by consent of the governed. These ideas seemed chaotic, impossible. How could a nation function if people could question their leaders? How could military efficiency exist if soldiers could refuse orders? But Mr. Hayashi patiently explained that America was not without discipline, not without structure. The difference, he said, is that Americans believe the government exists to serve the people, not the people to serve the government. It is not perfect. Look at what they did to Japanese Americans like me. But the system allows for change, for questioning, for growth. In Japan, Yuki said carefully, we are taught that to question is to betray, that the nation is a family with the emperor as father. To disobey is to abandon your family. Mr. Hayashi nodded sadly. And that is a beautiful idea when the father is wise and kind. But what happens when the father sends his children to die for his pride? When the family structure becomes a cage? Yuki had no answer. But the question burrowed into her mind and would not leave. For some nurses, the internal conflict manifested as physical symptoms. Hana stopped eating, her guilt over thriving while Japan starved, manifesting as an eating disorder. Others developed insomnia, unable to sleep without nightmares of judgment from dead comrades. A few attempted to maintain strict Japanese military discipline, waking early for exercises, maintaining formal hierarchies among themselves, speaking only Japanese even when English would have been practical. It was a way to hold on to identity in a world that threatened to wash it away. But even they felt the erosion. Because every day, every interaction, every small kindness from an American was evidence that what they had been taught was incomplete at best, lies at worst. And accepting that meant accepting that they had sacrificed everything, youth, health, innocence, comrades, for a cause that had been built on deception. It was not just painful, it was identity destroying. and there was no clear path through it, only the day-to-day experience of living with contradiction until something had to break. 2 months in, the nightly conversations in the dormitories grew more intense, more honest, more dangerous. The nurses had stopped speaking in euphemisms. They said what they meant, even when it hurt. One night, a nurse named Akiko, who had been a fervent nationalist, broke down. "I do not understand," she sobbed. "We were told we were the superior race. We were told Americans were beasts, but they treat us better than our own military ever did. They give us more dignity than we gave our own wounded soldiers. What does that mean?" "It means we were lied to," Yuki said quietly. Her voice had lost its youthful uncertainty. 2 months of education and observation had hardened something in her. "We were lied to from the beginning." "Do not say that," another nurse hissed. "Even here you cannot say that. It is treason." "Treason against what?" Yuki shot back. "Against an empire that sent us to die with poison pills rather than face the truth? Against a government that told us enemies were monsters while they fed and clothed and paid us? If this is treason, then what was loyalty?" The room fell silent. They had all thought it, but hearing it spoken aloud was still shocking. Keiko spoke into the silence, her voice steady. "I have been thinking about the wounded. The Japanese soldiers we treated in the field hospitals. Do you remember what we had to work with? Bandages we washed and reused until they fell apart. Morphine so expired it barely worked. Surgeries performed without anesthesia because we had none. And we were told this was honorable, that suffering built character. Now I work in an American hospital. They have penicillin. They have clean bandages for every patient. They have morphine that actually works. They have blood transfusions and x-ray machines and antibiotics. And you know what? Their wounded survive. At rates we never saw. Because they value keeping their soldiers alive." She paused, and when she continued, her voice cracked. "We were told American industrial strength was a sign of moral weakness, that our spiritual purity would overcome their material advantage. But I have seen the truth. They won because they valued human life enough to invest in keeping people alive, and we lost because we valued death more than life." Hana, who had been lying silent on her bed, finally spoke. "Do you know what I learned today? Lieutenant Morrison told me that American military doctrine requires 3 support soldiers for every combat soldier. 3 to 1. Logistics, supply, medical, administration. Japan barely had 1 to 1. We sent boys to fight with barely enough bullets and called it honor." "It was not honor," Yuki said. "It was suicide. National suicide dressed up in beautiful words about cherry blossoms and the way of the warrior." The debates fractured them along generational and experiential lines. Older nurses, those who remembered pre-war Japan, sometimes defended the old ways more fiercely. They had more invested in the story of Japanese superiority. Younger nurses, those who had known only war, found it easier to question, to adapt, to accept new truths. But even the divisions were instructive. In Japan, such debates would have been impossible. Questioning national policy was thought crime. But here, in this strange American captivity, they could argue, question, even doubt. And no one punished them for it. One night, Keiko asked the question that haunted them all. "If we return to Japan thinking like this, what happens? Can we go back to the old ways? Can we unsee what we have seen?" No one had an answer, because they all knew the truth. They were being changed by this experience in ways that could not be reversed. America was not just holding them physically, it was remaking them ideologically, not through force or propaganda, but through the simple demonstration of alternative values in action. And the most terrifying part was that these alternative values, individual worth, material prosperity, valuing life over death, were working. They could see it in their own health, their own full bellies, their own survival. The proof was undeniable. 3 months into captivity, the facility organized an educational program for the nurses. It was optional, and some refused to attend, seeing it as indoctrination. But curiosity drove most of them to the converted auditorium where a screen had been set up for film presentations. The first film was documentary footage of the liberation of Nazi concentration camps. The American narrator explained in English, with Mr. Hayashi providing Japanese translation. But the images needed no translation. Skeletal bodies, mass graves, gas chambers, the industrial machinery of genocide laid bare for the world to see. The nurses watched in horror. Some walked out, some vomited, many wept, because while they had not known the specific details of Nazi camps, they had heard whispers of Japanese atrocities in China, in the Philippines, in Korea. They had heard and not wanted to believe. The second film showed American industrial capacity. Footage of factories producing planes, tanks, ships at speeds that seemed impossible. The narrator explained that at the war's peak, American industry was launching a new ship every day, completing a new aircraft every 5 minutes. Yuki watched with growing understanding. This was why they lost. Not because Americans were more spiritual or more honorable, but because they had built a system that could outproduce Japan 100 to 1. Bushido could not compete with assembly lines, but the third film was the one that changed everything. It showed American civilians during the war, women working in factories, victory gardens and backyards, rationing, yes, but abundant rationing, children still playing in parks, stores still open, a nation at war that had not been destroyed by war. The contrast to Japan, where cities burned, children starved, and civilians died by the hundreds of thousands, was overwhelming. America had fought the war with less than a quarter of its population. It had fought on two fronts, across two oceans, and its homeland had never been touched. After the films, Mr. Hayashi led a discussion. "You have seen American power," he said. "But power alone does not explain this. The question is, why does this system work when others collapse?" Keiko, surprising herself, raised her hand. "Because they do not treat people as expendable. Every worker, every soldier, every citizen is treated as valuable. The system is built to keep them alive and productive. Our system asked us to die beautifully." Mr. Hayashi nodded slowly. "And which system do you think is more powerful? The one that asks people to die for it, or the one that fights to keep them alive?" The silence was profound, because they all knew the answer. They were living proof of it. That night, the dormitory conversations reached a new level. They spoke about democracy not as an abstract concept, but as a practical system. They discussed individual rights not as Western weakness, but as the foundation of national strength. They questioned whether a divine emperor could make mistakes, and whether a people could be truly great if they could not question their leaders. These were revolutionary thoughts. In Japan, they would lead to prison or worse. But here, in this strange space between war and peace, captivity and freedom, Japanese and American, they could think the unthinkable. Yuki wrote in her own journal, in careful English she had been practicing, "If dignity is the greatest weapon, then America has already won the peace, because they did not just defeat us, they showed us a better way. And that is harder to resist than any army." The deeper recognition was settling over them like a new skin. They had not just been defeated militarily. They had been proven wrong philosophically. The entire worldview they had been raised with, that sacrifice and suffering were virtues, that death was preferable to dishonor, that the collective always outweighed the individual, had been challenged by a society that valued life, prosperity, and individual happiness. And that society had won. Decisively, overwhelmingly. Not through cruelty, but through competence. Not through brutality, but through industrial might, built on the foundation of free people working for their own benefit. It was a lesson that would stay with them forever, whether they wanted it to or not. The moment that would define everything came on a crisp October morning, 4 months into their captivity. The facility had announced a special visit. A group of American veterans who had fought in the Pacific would be touring the grounds as part of a reconciliation program. The nurses were given a choice. They could remain in their dormitories, or they could attend a meeting with these veterans. It was entirely voluntary. No pressure, no requirements, just an opportunity. Many chose to stay away. The thought of facing men they had essentially been at war with was too much. But Keiko, Yuki, and Hana decided to go. They could not explain why, even to themselves. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was a need to understand. Perhaps it was the beginning of healing. The meeting was held in the common room, arranged with chairs in a circle rather than in rows. Everything about it was designed to feel less formal, more human. Coffee and cookies sat on a side table, those same oatmeal cookies that had shocked them on the ship months ago. 10 American veterans sat on one side, 10 Japanese nurses on the other. Between them, translators and mediators from the Red Cross. And in the middle, a chasm of experience, trauma, and loss that seemed impossible to bridge. The American who spoke first was a man in his 50s, a Marine who had fought at Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima. His name was Thomas Fletcher, and he walked with a cane from a wound that had never fully healed. Through the translator, he said, "I'm not going to pretend this is easy. I lost friends to Japanese soldiers. I saw things that will never leave me. For a long time, I hated. It was easier than trying to understand." He paused, looking at each of the nurses in turn. "But then I started thinking about something my chaplain said on the ship home. He said that hate is heavy. It weighs you down until you drown in it, and I realized that the war took enough from me. I wasn't going to let it take my humanity, too." Another veteran spoke, a younger man who had been a pilot. "You were told we were demons. We were told you were fanatics who would never surrender. Both sides were taught to see the other as less than human. But look at us now. We're just people. Damaged people, but people." The floor was open to the nurses. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Hana stood, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "My brother died fighting Americans," she said through the translator, her voice steady but her eyes bright with tears. "He was 19. He wrote me a letter before his last battle. He said he was not afraid to die for the Emperor. But I wonder now. I wonder if he should have been afraid. I wonder if dying so young for so little was really honor, or if it was just waste." Her words hit like stones in still water, ripples spreading through the room. Several veterans nodded slowly. One wiped his eyes. Thomas Fletcher leaned forward. Your brother and my friends, they were following orders. They were doing what they thought was right. The tragedy is that our leaders sent us to kill each other over things that could have been resolved other ways. The real enemy was never you or me. It was the systems that made war seem like the only option. Then Yuki stood. She was shaking, but her voice was clear. When we were captured, I carried poison. Cyanide. I was ready to die rather than face what I thought you would do to us. And then the first thing you gave us was blankets and food. And someone said in Japanese, Kawai nai. Don't be afraid. She was crying now, and she did not try to hide it. Those 2 words destroyed everything I believed. Because if you were not the demons we were taught you were, then what were we fighting for? If you could show mercy when we expected cruelty, then what did that make our nation that told us you had no mercy? The translator's voice broke as she rendered Yuki's words into English. In the silence that followed, Thomas Fletcher stood and crossed the space between them. He stopped in front of Yuki, this old Marine who had killed Japanese soldiers on Pacific Islands, and he held out his hand. Don't be afraid, he said in carefully practiced Japanese. Kawai nai. Yuki looked at his hand, weathered and scarred, and something inside her broke completely. She took it, and he held her hand gently while she cried. Not tears of fear this time, but tears of release. Release from hatred, from propaganda, from the burden of carrying lies that had poisoned her understanding of the world. Around the room, other hands reached across the divide. American veterans and Japanese nurses, enemies by decree, humans by nature, finding in each other not monsters but mirror reflections of trauma and survival. Keiko sat watching, and in that moment she understood something profound. The most devastating weapon was not the atomic bomb or the firebombing or the naval blockade. It was this: being shown dignity when you expected degradation. Being given humanity when you had been taught to expect brutality. Being offered a hand when you had carried poison to avoid capture. Because cruelty could be resisted. Hatred could be matched with hatred. But kindness, unexpected and undeserved, disarmed completely. It forced you to see your enemy as human. And once you saw their humanity, you could not unsee your own complicity in a system that had denied it. That night, back in the dormitory, the nurses who had attended sat together in silence for a long time. Finally, Keiko spoke. I think this was what defeat really means. Not the loss of battles or territory, but the moment when you realize your enemy was right about something fundamental and you were wrong. They told us we were superior, that our way was the only way, that death with honor mattered more than life with dignity, and we believed them because we knew nothing else. But now we know, Yuki said softly, and we can never unknow it. Hana nodded. The question is, what do we do with this knowledge? When we return to Japan, do we speak it? Do we become traitors to the old ways to be faithful to the truth? Or do we stay silent and become traitors to ourselves? They had no answers yet, but the questions themselves represented a transformation that would have been impossible 4 months ago. They were thinking critically about their nation, their culture, their beliefs. They were questioning authority. They were choosing their own minds over received wisdom. In that moment, in that American facility, surrounded by former enemies who had shown them unexpected humanity, these Japanese nurses completed their metamorphosis from soldiers of the empire to free-thinking individuals. It was not a comfortable transformation. It was painful, disorienting, and carried a cost that would follow them forever. But it was also liberation. The truest kind. Not from physical captivity, but from mental bondage. December 1945. The announcement came just before Christmas. The nurses would be repatriated in January. Ships were being prepared. They would return to Japan, to their families, to whatever remained of their homes. The news that should have brought joy instead brought anxiety so profound that several nurses became physically ill. They had been prisoners for 5 months. 5 months of adequate food, medical care, safety, and dignity. 5 months of transformation that could not be reversed. Keiko lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, terrified. Not of America anymore, but of Japan. Of returning to a nation that lay in ruins, where her knowledge and experience would mark her as contaminated. Where her weight gain and health would be evidence of collaboration. Where the truth she had learned would be dangerous to speak. I do not know how to be Japanese anymore, she confessed to Yuki one evening. I have learned to think like an individual, to question authority, to value my own life. These are not Japanese virtues. They will see it in me. They will know I have been changed. Yuki nodded. At 19, she would return to a country she barely remembered without the fog of war. My mother will want the daughter she sent away, the obedient girl who believed everything she was told. But that girl is dead. The Americans killed her with kindness. How do I explain that to my mother? Some nurses tried to prepare themselves by reasserting Japanese identity. They practiced sitting in seiza despite the availability of chairs. They spoke only Japanese. They distanced themselves from American staff. It was as if they could shed the last 5 months like a snake sheds skin. But others like Keiko knew it was impossible. The change had gone too deep. They had seen too much, learned too much, felt too much. America had not just held them physically, it had given them a glimpse of a different world, a different way of being human. And once you saw it, you could not unsee it. Lieutenant Morrison found Keiko crying in the hospital supply room 2 weeks before departure. She sat down beside her, not speaking, just present. Finally, through the interpreter who still accompanied them sometimes, she said, "You're afraid to go home." Keiko nodded, unable to speak. "I understand," Morrison said. "You're not the same person you were, and you're afraid they won't understand the change, that they'll see it as betrayal." "Is it not betrayal?" Keiko whispered. "I have lived well while they starved. I have worked for the enemy. I have learned to respect Americans. Is that not betrayal of everything I was supposed to be?" Morrison was quiet for a moment. Then, "Or maybe it's the truest loyalty. Loyalty to what Japan could become, not what it was. Someone has to carry these lessons home. Someone has to remember that enemies can become friends, that systems can change, that there's a better way. Maybe that's your mission now." January 23rd, 1946. The ship that carried them back to Japan was American, but the mood was Japanese, silent, heavy with unspoken fears. They stood at the rail as the Japanese coastline emerged from winter mist. Even from a distance, they could see the devastation. The port city where they docked had been largely destroyed. Makeshift structures stood among ruins. People in ragged clothes moved through the streets like ghosts. Children with hollow eyes watched the ship arrive. This was the Japan they had left, but somehow seeing it after months in America made the destruction more stark, more painful. Keiko's family met her at the port. Her mother had aged a decade in 2 years. Her younger sister was rail-thin, her dress hanging on a frame that spoke of prolonged hunger. They embraced, and Keiko felt her mother's bones through her clothes. Her mother pulled back and looked at her. Really looked. And Keiko saw the moment recognition shifted to confusion, to something like hurt. Because Keiko was healthy. Her cheeks had color, her body had weight. She looked like someone who had been fed. You look well," her mother said, and the words carried accusation, relief, and incomprehension in equal measure. The journey to Osaka took 3 days by train through a landscape of devastation. Burned cities. Displaced people living in train stations. Children begging at stops. The wealth gap between where she had been and where she was now felt obscene, impossible to bridge. Yuki's reunion was worse. Her mother wept, but could barely hold her. "Your father is dead," she said. "Your brother is missing. The house is gone. We live with your aunt now, 7 of us in 2 rooms. And you were eating well in America while we starved here?" The accusation was not spoken with malice, but with the broken confusion of someone who could not process the injustice of their daughter thriving in captivity while they suffered in freedom. Many nurses faced similar receptions. Some families were simply grateful they were alive, but others, those who had suffered most, struggled with the visible health of their returned daughters. The nurses had expected punishment from Americans. They received it instead from their own people, in the form of resentment, suspicion, and the unbridgeable distance between their experiences. Some lied about their treatment. They spoke of hardship, hunger, cruelty that had never occurred. It was easier than explaining the truth, easier than admitting they had been cared for by the enemy better than by their own nation. But others like Keiko chose a harder path. They told the truth, carefully, selectively, planting seeds of a different understanding. They spoke of Americans as humans, not demons. They talked about systems that valued life. They suggested quietly that perhaps there were lessons to learn from defeat. It made them outsiders in their own country. But it also made them bridges to a different future. Keiko Yamamoto returned to nursing in the post-war Japanese healthcare system. She brought with her techniques she had learned from American nurses, standards of care that seemed impossible in resource-starved Japan, but which she fought to implement anyway. She married in 1948 a doctor who had served in China and carried his own trauma. They never spoke much about the war, but when their daughter was born in 1950, Keiko made sure to teach her something her own mother never had. To question, to think critically, to value her own individual worth. In the 1960s, when her daughter asked about the war, Keiko finally told the full story. About the cyanide pills, about the fear, about the blankets and the food, and about the words that changed everything. Kawai nai. Don't be afraid. The Americans taught me something our leaders never did, she told her daughter. They taught me that my life had value, not as a tool for the state, not as a symbol of national honor, but as an individual human life worth preserving. And once you learn that about yourself, you cannot help but see it in others. That is what defeated us. Not their bombs, but their humanity. Yuki Tanaka became a teacher. She taught English to a new generation of Japanese students, but more than language, she taught them to think internationally, to question authority respectfully, to understand that no nation has a monopoly on truth or virtue. Some of her students went on to become leaders in Japan's democratic rebuilding. They carried with them, often without knowing its source, ideas that had been planted by a young nurse who had learned them as a prisoner of war. Hanasato wrote a memoir in the 1970s, one of the first honest accounts of Japanese POW experiences in American captivity. It was controversial, criticized by some as revisionist, praised by others as necessary truth-telling, but it opened a conversation about how narratives of war are constructed and how propaganda shapes national memory. Of the 127 nurses who were repatriated in January 1946, most lived quiet lives, their transformation internal and private. But they carried with them in countless small ways the lessons of their captivity. They raised children with different values. They questioned systems more readily. They built a post-war Japan that, while still distinctly Japanese, had learned something from defeat. The universal truth they carried was this, that the most powerful weapon is not violence but dignity. That the greatest victory is not in destroying your enemy but in showing them a better way. That sometimes mercy cuts deeper than the sword because it cannot be resisted with force, only with an opening of the heart. And so the words kowai nai, don't be afraid, became more than a simple phrase spoken by an American sailor to frighten prisoners. They became a key that unlocked a prison made of propaganda, fear, and lies about the nature of the enemy. For 127 Japanese nurses who expected torture and received blankets, who prepared for death and were given life, who carried poison but were offered milk and cookies, those two words represented a revolution of understanding. They learned that the enemy they had been taught to fear were human beings capable of mercy. They learned that strength could be measured not in willingness to die, but in the ability to help others live. They learned that systems matter, that governance matters, that values matter, and that a nation built on individual dignity will always outlast one built on collective sacrifice. The irony was not lost on them. They were defeated not by cruelty but by kindness, not by barbarity but by civilization, not by the destruction of their bodies but by the transformation of their minds. In the decades that followed, as Japan rebuilt itself into one of the world's great democracies, traces of these lessons could be found in unexpected places. In the constitution that valued individual rights, in the healthcare system that treated all patients with dignity, in the education system that taught critical thinking alongside traditional values, in the small, quiet ways that a defeated nation became a peaceful one. Not all of it came from 127 nurses, of course. Japan's transformation had many sources, many architects, but they were part of it. They carried home the knowledge that the enemy had been more human than expected, and that humanity was a strength, not a weakness. As Keiko told her granddaughter decades later, holding a photograph of herself in an American nurse's uniform, "The greatest defeat is not losing a war. It is discovering that everything you fought for was built on lies. But the greatest victory is finding the courage to accept truth and build something better from the ruins." She paused, touching the photograph with aged fingers. They said, "Don't be afraid." And I wasn't. Not of them. Only of going home and trying to explain that our enemies had been the ones to teach us what it meant to be truly human. And that is the story worth remembering, not just as a footnote to World War II, but as a testament to what happens when nations choose dignity over vengeance, when individuals choose truth over comfortable lies, and when two words spoken in broken Japanese can shatter a worldview built on hatred and fear. The cyanide pills those nurses carried were meant to end their lives. Instead, American kindness forced them to truly live, to think, to question, to grow, to become more than what their nation had taught them to be. And that is a victory deeper than any military conquest, more lasting than any peace treaty. If this story has touched you, if it has made you think differently about enemies and allies, about war and peace, about the power of simple human kindness in the darkest times, then please hit that like button and subscribe. These stories, these moments of unexpected humanity buried in the history of our worst conflicts, deserve to be remembered and shared. Because if we can learn anything from Keiko, Yuki, Hana, and the other 124 nurses who carried this lesson home, it is that the path from enemy to friend, from hatred to understanding, begins with two simple words: don't be afraid.